Imagine breastfeeding someone else's baby every day for years while your own child is sent off to die. Congratulations, you're now a wet nurse in Renaissance Europe. No, it's not exactly a career move you chose. More like the side hustle poverty threw at you. You've got leaking breasts, emotional trauma, and a job contract that treats you worse than the family goat. And spoiler alert, everyone still blames you when the rich kid gets sick. Welcome to the world of bodily sacrifice for rent money. It's tender, it's tragic, it's deeply leaky. If this already sounds like the weirdest job on LinkedIn, hit that like button. Subscribe for more unsettling history, and settle in, because we're just getting to the part where the milk gets political. So, let's say it's a humid spring morning in Florence. The year is 1512. The Medici are scheming. Michelangelo is probably yelling at marble, and somewhere across town you, a sleep-deprived woman with breasts that feel like overinflated wineskins, are about to get paid to feed a baby who isn't yours. Not metaphorically. Literally. You are now officially someone's biological outsourcing solution. Congratulations. You've just been hired as a wet nurse. Now, if your first thought is, oh, like a nanny with cleavage, I hate to break it to you. No, this isn't some romanticized pastoral gig with lullabies and soft focus lighting. It's capitalism. With nipple. A wet nurse in Renaissance Europe was not just someone who helped. She was someone who replaced. She stepped into a job the baby's biological mother refused, or more often, was strongly discouraged to do. And that refusal? It wasn't always about health, or risk, or even comfort. Sometimes it was because noble women didn't want to ruin their figures, other times because they needed to get pregnant again, fast. But often, it was just because it was seen as unseemly, undignified, too. So instead, they handed the baby off to you. You, the woman who probably just had a child of your own, now hired to nourish an infant who, if we're being brutally honest, will never know your name. Let's dig into what made wet nursing a thing. Because trust me, no one woke up one day and thought, you know what would be a chill career path? Feeding other people's screaming aristocratic infants for 18 hours a day while praying I don't get blamed if one of them dies. This whole bizarre economy started with a deadly combo platter: sky-high infant mortality and equally high fertility expectations. Noble women were expected to pop out as many heirs as possible, as quickly as possible. But breastfeeding delays ovulation, nature's slow down button. So, in steps the workaround. Outsource the milk. Outsource the delay. Keep the womb on a tight schedule. Oh, and don't forget the ever-present fear that breastfeeding would somehow corrupt a woman's bloodline. Yes, that was an actual belief, that a mother's emotions, health, and moral character could leak into her milk and taint the baby. Want to make sure your heir turns out noble and brave and not, God forbid, emotionally unstable? Then maybe don't risk feeding him your anxious postnatal peasant milk, says Dr. 16th century guy who's never seen a breast. The solution? Find a healthy, morally upright, physically robust woman with no opinions and very full breasts. That's you, sweetheart. But before you get too proud of landing this gig, let's talk pay. Wet nurses were technically well compensated, especially compared to, say, the guy shoveling night soil in the alley. But don't imagine a Venetian villa or silken pillows. Your payment might come in installments, docked for infractions like catching a cold, or talking too much, or letting the baby cry too long. You may be living in a shed behind the estate, or on a dirt floor back in the countryside. Welcome to the gig economy, Renaissance edition. Oh, and don't think your own child is welcome on the job. Nope. In most cases, to qualify as a wet nurse, you had to leave your baby behind. Sometimes with relatives, sometimes with neighbors, sometimes with no one. The math is horrifying. Your baby, the one your body made, gets separated from you, often within days of birth, so that someone else's baby, someone wealthier, someone better, can be full and warm and alive. Let that sink in. You're asked to bond with a stranger's infant while being forcibly detached from your own. And yet, Thousands of women did it. Because the alternative was worse. No food, no coin, no chance. Wet nursing was often one of the only ways a poor woman could earn semi-reliable income without selling her body in the streets or dying of starvation. And hey, in some warped way, it still involved bodily labor, just not in a way anyone wrote love songs about. Let's be clear, this wasn't a noble calling. It was survival. So what kind of woman signed up for this? Usually one who had no other choice. She'd be healthy, or appear to be. Probably recently delivered a child of her own. Desperately poor, often rural, and very, very quiet. Silence was a plus. Nobody wanted a chatty milkmaid, disrupting the noble estate with opinions, or, God forbid, conversation. She had to be strong. Emotionally, physically, she had to deal with engorgement, infections, the constant gnaw of a baby that wasn't hers. She had to sit still when the child cried for its mother, not her, even as she cradled it, fed it, loved it, in silence. And when the job ended, sometimes abruptly, sometimes cruelly, she had to disappear. No goodbye, no thank you. Just the latch of a door and the echo of footsteps walking back to the poverty she'd tried to climb out of. So here's the golden question. What did she lose? Everything. Time, identity, milk, sometimes her own child, but more than that, she lost the right to be seen. In a world obsessed with lineage, she was erased. Her labor was intimate, essential, and utterly invisible. But not here, not today, because this is her story. And we're just getting started. Alright, you've got the gig. The baby has latched. Your breasts are working overtime, like a Renaissance espresso machine. And your employer, a woman who hasn't made eye contact with her own child, has gone back to reading poetry or getting pregnant again. Congrats, you're officially employed. Now, the real horror begins. Because here's the one thing nobody told you. You're only as valuable as the baby's next bowel movement. Your job performance is directly measured in grams of weight gain, frequency of sleep, and how long the baby cries before it shuts up. Miss the mark on any of those, you're out. Or worse. See, infant mortality was already absurdly high in the Renaissance. Like, horrifyingly high. Depending on the region and year, somewhere between 30 to 50% of children didn't make it past their 5th birthday. And do you know what that kind of statistic breeds? Scapegoats. Fast. Because guess what happens when the baby dies under your watch? Even though it's the 16th century, the water's filled with plague, and nobody believes in germ theory. Do you think the noble family blames the air quality, the fact that their house is colder than a crypt and filled with candle soot? Nope. They blame you. That's right. You, the underpaid woman, with cracked nipples and no medical degree, are now responsible for the survival of a shrieking future heir, and there's no margin for error. None. So what do? You follow the rules. Obsessively, painfully, hysterically, because wet nursing came with a massive instruction manual. Literally, dozens of books and treatises were written by very concerned men about the proper conduct and lifestyle of a virtuous wet nurse. That's right. They didn't just want your milk, they wanted your soul aligned with the child's moral development. Let's start with food. You can't eat onions, garlic, beans, cabbage. Anything spicy, bitter, or even mildly provocative is off limits. Why? Because it might taint the milk. That's right. Apparently one leak, and suddenly your breast milk turns into a toxic potion that causes infant melancholy. Want meat? Not too much. Want wine? Better water it down. Want to chew bread too enthusiastically? Maybe slow down. Bread enthusiasm could lead to wind, and wind leads to colic, which leads to screaming, which leads to you getting screamed at. But it doesn't stop at food. No, your moods matter too. According to Renaissance manuals, your emotional state imprints itself onto your milk. Feeling angry? Congratulations, you've just brewed a gallon of rage-flavored formula. Feeling anxious? Better suck it up. Literally, because your sadness might cause the baby to grow up with a weak spine and disordered wit. One writer, a guy named Cyrannus, who sounds like a villain from Game of Thrones, but was actually a Greco-Roman physician, beloved by Renaissance medics, insisted that ideal wet nurses must be cheerful, chaste, moderately plump, and not prone to melancholy. In other words, you had to be the human equivalent of a golden retriever, loyal, sunny, and completely unthreatening. Let's not even get into sex. Actually, no, let's absolutely get into sex. Because if you were a wet nurse under contract, you were almost always forbidden from having it. Not just discouraged, forbidden. Why? Because pregnancy stops lactation. Because male attention is distracting. Because noblemen didn't want their legacy. And let's be honest, that's how they saw their babies, contaminated by your bedroom activities. So your contract included clauses like must remain continent during service, or may not lay with husband or stranger for term of employment. If you broke that clause and someone found out, fired. No pay, maybe legal trouble, all while still lactating. And here's the kicker, you're still not trusted. Even after following all the ridiculous rules, even after handing over your life and body to this child, suspicion lingers. You're watched, judged, whispered about. You're a servant with too much intimacy, a stranger with too much influence, and if the baby gets a rash, develops a cough, or, heaven forbid, cries too much, they don't ask what's wrong with the baby. They ask what you did. And what about the mother? The one you're technically replacing? Does she help? Offer guidance? Visit her child occasionally? Oh no. Most aristocratic mothers in Renaissance Europe didn't just delegate the breastfeeding. They delegated everything. Holding, bathing, comforting. Some wouldn't even see their children for weeks after birth, especially if the baby was sent out to a rural wet nurse. And those who kept their babies in-house, they often refused to bond, because that wasn't their job. You were the mother, at least in practice, but not in title. And if the mother did bother to check in, you had to tread carefully. Too much bonding? You're a threat. Too little? You're neglectful. You had to live in the uncanny valley of maternal substitution. Deeply intimate, yet entirely invisible. And so, every day, you did the one thing you were paid to do. You kept the baby alive. You measured sleep with your pulse, tracked weight gain with your fingers, noticed fevers before the physician could even smell them. You knew that baby better than anyone, and still, you were dispensable. Just one bad night, one ill-timed cry, one cough. That's all it took. Your milk, sacred one day, suspicious the next. So yeah, breathe that in. The pressure, the exhaustion, the strange, sacred absurdity of being someone else's everything, while being treated like nothing. And here's the real kicker. It only gets harder from here. Picture this. You've just given birth. Your body aches in ways you didn't know were anatomically possible. Your child, your own tiny, wrinkled, warm miracle, is barely a few days old. And now, you have to give them away. Not because you want to. Not because you're a monster. But because someone else's baby is hungrier, wealthier, more important. This isn't a twist in a Dickens novel. This is the standard operating procedure for Renaissance wet nurses. If you were a lower-class woman applying for the job, and really applying is a generous word for begging the steward for coin, then one of the first requirements was that you had milk to spare, which meant you had just delivered your own baby. Recently. Like, very recent. And here's the tragic part. Your baby wasn't coming with you. In most cases you had two options. 1. Send your child to a relative, if you were lucky enough to have a sister or mother still breathing. Or 2. Arrange for another. The Renaissance. An age of enlightenment, rebirth, and meticulous spreadsheets about breast milk. Yep, behind the paintings, the poetry, and the public beheadings was a robust and surprisingly bureaucratic system dedicated to managing the literal flow of milk from one woman's chest to another's child's mouth. Welcome to the Renaissance boob economy. It all starts with demand. Upper-class women were not just passively avoiding breastfeeding, they were actively encouraged to outsource it. Doctors, priests, and beauty manuals all warned of the dangers of nursing one's own child. The rationale: it was unfashionable, it was unhealthy, it was unflattering, and most importantly, it slowed down reproduction. And that was a no-go for aristocratic families building their legacies like real estate portfolios. So what do you do when half the noble population refuses to feed their babies? You build a system to make someone else do it. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Paris developed full-on infrastructures to support the booming wet nurse industry. This wasn't just a couple of desperate women hoping for side gigs. It was an entire ecosystem, with recruitment agents, contracts, supply routes, housing, inspections, and financial audits. Let's start with recruitment. If you were a wet nurse candidate, your first stop might be a broker, someone who specialized in matching lactating women with wealthy employers. This person would examine you, not just your milk supply, but your teeth, your temperament, your skin tone, and even your accent. Too rural, risk of low intellect. Too chatty, risk of moral corruption. Too dark-skinned, risk of societal panic. Some Italian cities even kept official registries of approved wet nurses. Venice, ever the overachiever, had records so precise they bordered on creepy: name, place of origin, age, recent childbirth date, number of prior jobs, all logged in careful handwriting next to notes like good disposition or milk of fine color. Once selected, you signed a contract. And oh, the contracts. These weren't vague napkin scribbles. These were ironclad documents, detailing exactly how much milk you were expected to produce, how often the child should be fed, what you could eat, where you would sleep, how many hours of rest you were allowed, and what sort of punishment you'd receive if anything went wrong. Payment terms were usually monthly, sometimes quarterly. Often the final installment was withheld until the child survived past a certain milestone. 6 months, a year, toddlerhood. This wasn't just a job, it was a performance-based lactation agreement. And then came the audits. Yes, audits. In Paris, city officials dispatched health inspectors. Imagine a medieval HR rep with a clipboard to check on wet nurses. They would observe feedings, examine the child, and sometimes taste the milk. You heard me. There are accounts of inspectors dipping fingers into the milk, or even watching to see how the baby latched, just to make sure the nurse was the real deal. Meanwhile, the noble families were keeping their own logs. They tracked the baby's weight, bowel movements, sleeping habits, and emotional responses. These ledgers often sat beside records of livestock and grain sales, as if the infant was another asset in the household portfolio, which frankly it kind of was. And if a wet nurse underperformed, there was a whole procedure. She could be fired, replaced, fined, or worse. If accused of negligence, she might be brought before local authorities. Negligence, by the way, could mean anything from illness, to a missed feeding, to the child simply not thriving for reasons no one understood. In the eyes of the Renaissance upper class, wet nurses were both critical and disposable. They were simultaneously appraised as life-givers and policed like milk-producing criminals. And don't be fooled, this wasn't limited to households. Even hospitals got in on the action. Florence's Ospedale degli Innocenti, the foundling hospital famous for taking in abandoned children, employed wet nurses by the dozens. Some worked inside the hospital. Others, called external nurses, lived in the countryside and took batches of babies to raise like foster care. If foster care came with strict lactation quotas and zero emotional support. Let's pause here, because it's easy to drown in the absurdity of this system. The spreadsheets, the inspections, the contractual food clauses banning lentils. But behind all of it were women, real women with aching backs, cracked skin, and children they couldn't raise because someone else's baby needed feeding first. They were working mothers before the term existed, gig workers without apps, essential laborers before the world learned how to applaud from balconies. Their breasts were turned into public utilities. Their bodies became commerce. And yet, they endured. They adapted. Some even used the system to their advantage. There are records of women who became full-time, career wet nurses. They moved from one noble family to another, each gig giving them more clout, more coin, more security. Some were so prized they were passed between royal courts like rare artifacts. One woman in France, known simply as Jane, nursed 5 aristocratic children over 15 years. Her last employer called her the Wet Angel and had her portrait commissioned. A rarity so absurd it feels like satire. Imagine climbing the wet nursing ladder so high you end up hanging on someone's wall. But most didn't get portraits. Most didn't get endings at all. Their names vanished from the ledgers the moment their milk ran dry. No pensions, no legacy, just a long, leaky trail of anonymous survival. So yes, the Renaissance gave us Da Vinci and Botticelli, and humanism, and scientific progress. But it also gave us the first HR department for boobs. And somehow, that might be its most honest legacy. So you've been hired. The baby likes you, the milk is flowing. You haven't been blamed for any mysterious rashes or sudden coughing fits yet. Congratulations. You're officially in the system. Now let's talk rules. Because in the Renaissance world of wet nursing, you don't just hand over your breasts and call it a day. Oh no, you sign a contract, a real one, with conditions, with clauses, with all the legal fuss and micromanaging precision of a modern tech company's onboarding packet. Except instead of a laptop, you're issued an infant and a warning not to eat garlic. Let's begin with the golden rule. You don't own your body anymore. From the moment ink dries on your contract, everything, and I mean everything, is dictated by a combination of superstition, medicine, and unfiltered patriarchy. First, food. You must eat blandly. As in, nothing with flavor, excitement, or emotional potential. Bland. No onions, no garlic, no peppers, no wine. Definitely no mushrooms, which were believed to cause damp humors in the blood. Salt, only if blessed. Spices, forbidden, not because they taste good, but because Renaissance physicians thought spicy food turned your milk hot, which apparently made babies anxious and, I'm quoting here, overly curious. Second, emotions. You must not be sad, or angry, or even overly cheerful. Too much feeling was believed to agitate the blood, which could then sour your milk. So while your own baby might be rotting in a foundling hospital across town, you are contractually obligated to stay serene, preferably saint-like. But not too saint-like, because then you'd be suspected of harboring secret pride. Tricky. Third, sex. No, absolutely not. Forbidden. Written in large bold letters, at the bottom of most wet nurse contracts was the clause, may not engage in carnal relations during term of employment. If you had a husband, tough luck. If you didn't, even worse, because then they'd assume you would. The rationale here was part science, part paranoia, part outright misogyny. Pregnancy disrupts milk production, and male attention, any kind, even glances, was thought to disturb the balance of the female fluids. Basically, if you so much as looked at someone too long at the market, you were in danger of mixing lust into the baby's porridge. Unless you think these rules were symbolic or loosely enforced. No. Some contracts included surveillance. Yes, actual monitoring. Employers would assign servants to watch wet nurses, listen to them, track their behaviors. If a nurse was found speaking with strange men, sneaking sweets, or, horror of horrors, laughing too much, she could be dismissed. No warning, no final pay, just out. Milk or not. Let that sink in. You're lactating on demand, feeding someone else's child, mourning your own in silence. And you're also being policed, like a teenage girl at a Victorian boarding school. But it doesn't stop there. Some contracts went a step further and included physical descriptions. The ideal wet nurse, according to contemporary manuals, had clear skin, good teeth, medium build, symmetrical breasts, and, here's where it gets weird, a cheerful disposition without being too talkative. Too pale, you might be sickly. Too tan, possibly low class. Red hair, suspicious temperament. Left-handed, practically witchcraft. In some cases, you are expected to prove your temperament by answering moral questions. Imagine applying for a job and being asked, if your neighbor insults you during Mass, do you A. retaliate, B. cry, or C. offer a hymn of forgiveness? The answer, by the way, is C. Always. The whole thing wasn't just about milk, it was about control. A noble family didn't just want a healthy nurse. They wanted a pure one. A woman whose entire life aligned with their values, or at least didn't threaten them. Wet nurses were like moral wallpaper, ever present, quietly supportive, and never ever allowed to draw attention. And guess who wrote the contracts? Not you. Doctors, priests, male heads of household, sometimes even lawyers. All men, all deciding, in fine print, how a woman should eat, think, sleep, and breathe while she leaked nourishment into their future heir. It was patriarchy in legal form, not even dressed up. But here's the twist. Some women found ways to bend the rules. Quietly, subtly. They formed informal networks, shared food tips, hid tiny indulgences, swapped stories about their employers. Some even negotiated better terms, particularly those with previous experience, or a recommendation letter from another noble woman, a milk resume, if you will. There were cases, rare but documented, of wet nurses marrying upward. A nobleman becomes widowed. The nurse, having raised his child, becomes the closest female presence. One thing leads to another. Suddenly, she's no longer in the servants' quarters, she's at the head of the table. These stories were exceptions, but their existence shows that the women inside the system weren't all passive. They knew the game. Some played it well, others tried to rewrite the rules, but most just endured. Like Lena. Remember her? Still grieving her son, still feeding the Contessa's heir, still bound by a contract that tells her what she can eat, who she can see, and how she's allowed to feel. One evening, in the quiet dark, she meets the steward's cousin, a kind-eyed man who visits with books and sometimes brings apples. He's gentle, he makes her laugh. For a moment, she forgets the contract. For a moment, she forgets the rules. And that, dear listener, is how everything starts to unravel. Let's shift gears for a moment and step inside a church. It's Sunday morning in Renaissance Europe, and the incense is thick enough to choke a donkey. Sunlight spills through stained glass, casting halos on every powdered wig and polished boot. The priest ascends the pulpit. He's got fire in his belly and a sermon clutched in his hand. One that, bizarrely, is about breastfeeding. Specifically who should do it, how they should do it, and who's morally bankrupt if they don't. Welcome to the holy act of milk shaming. In Renaissance society, religion wasn't a side dish, it was the whole meal. Everything was filtered through theology, from marriage to menstruation to the exact hour you were supposed to bathe. So, naturally, something as intimate and primal as feeding a baby was stuffed with symbolism and slapped with a moral grading rubric. Let's start with the Madonna. The Virgin Mary was the icon of maternal virtue, and in countless paintings, she's depicted breastfeeding the infant Jesus, serenely, calmly, modestly, with an expression that says, "I'm saving humanity, but also just vibing." This wasn't just religious propaganda, it was behavioral instruction. Women were taught to see Mary as the ideal, a mother who nurtured personally, sacrificially, and silently. Breastfeeding wasn't just nourishment, it was an act of spiritual devotion, the holy transmission of virtue from womb to world, one squirming infant at a time. Now let's add class into the mix. Because noble women, the ones most likely to hire wet nurses, were caught in a moral double bind. On one hand, they were expected to mirror Mary's maternal piety. On the other, They were also expected to produce heirs efficiently, maintain beauty, and participate in society, which meant outsourcing the very act that made Mary holy. Cue the guilt, and the sermons, and the guilt-driven donations to charities for abandoned children. Priests would sermonize about cold-hearted mothers who refused to nurse their own children, comparing them to wolves, witches, or worse, selfish women who dared to value comfort over sacrifice. Meanwhile, wet nurses were praised as vessels of virtue until they were. Because here's the wild part. Wet nurses, too, were subjected to theological scrutiny. Their bodies were seen as tools of divine nourishment, but also potential sources of sin. Remember, these were women feeding someone else's legacy. If they were impure, immoral, or just slightly too attractive, they were suddenly dangerous, contaminated, a spiritual liability. One 15th century French sermon warned that a child who suckles the milk of a wicked woman shall inherit her vices. That's right. Apparently moral corruption could be absorbed like calcium. A nurse who had premarital sex, that baby might grow up to lie. A nurse who gossiped, that child might develop a lisp. A nurse who questioned the authority of men, well, that baby might become French. Okay, that last part isn't in the text, but you get the idea. The result was a kind of divine catch-22. If you were a wet nurse, your work was sacred, unless you were too human, too flawed, too much yourself. So, you were expected to disappear, and not just physically, spiritually. You had to embody virtue without receiving the credit, be maternal without being mother, be intimate without ever stepping into love. And what happened when a baby got sick? God help you, literally. Because it wasn't just the physicians you had to answer to, it was the church. A fever might be seen as divine punishment. A cough, the echo of your sin. Your body became the battleground for moral purity. One drop of milk, one impure thought, and suddenly you're the reason the baby developed night terrors or, God forbid, freckles. The church even weighed in on wet nurse selection. In some cities, bishops issued official guidelines. Preference was given to married women of good repute. Widows were viewed with suspicion. Too much emotional baggage. Unmarried women, a scandal waiting to happen. It was easier to believe in transubstantiation than it was to imagine a single woman with moral character. And yet, behind all the scolding, something more complicated was happening. There are letters, quiet, rare things, from noble women who confided in their confessors about their guilt, about the emptiness they felt, handing over their children, about the loneliness of being praised for efficiency while mourning the loss of closeness. These weren't villains, they were women caught in a system that demanded they choose between virtue and survival, and then judged them either way. There are also records of wet nurses, like Lena, who prayed every night, not for herself, but for the child she fed, who lit candles, who wept during Mass when the baby's mother didn't show, who bore the weight of someone else's guilt while quietly carrying her own. Let that sink in. Your job is a bodily act of love, judged like a sin, and then painted over in gold leaf, hung in a cathedral, and forgotten. The irony is inescapable. The very act that defined the divine feeding, nurturing, sacrificing, became, in the hands of men, a bureaucratized, moralized, tightly surveilled system of control. The milk of human kindness pasteurized through patriarchy, but still, it flowed, despite the sermons, despite the shame, despite the crushing weight of expectation. The milk flowed, and with it the stories of the women who poured themselves into others, drop by drop, while the world debated whether they were holy or just convenient. It starts with a twitch, a gummy smile, a tiny hand curled around your finger a little too long. At first it's nothing. You rock the baby because it won't sleep. You hum because silence feels heavier than sound. You wipe its face after feeding, hold it during hiccups, and whisper nonsense to keep yourself sane in the long, brutal quiet. But then, one morning, the baby looks up at you, and giggles. Not at the mother, not at the nursemaid or steward or physician. And suddenly, it's not nothing anymore. This is dangerous. Because while your job is to feed the baby, love was never in the contract. Wet nurses, for all their rules and responsibilities, walked a tightrope that dangled between biology and affection. Too cold, and you'd be accused of negligence. Too warm, and suddenly everyone's uncomfortable, especially the mother. Let's talk about that mother. She might be noble, beautiful, distant, or maybe she's overwhelmed. Maybe no one told her how to mother without assistance. Maybe she genuinely believes she's doing what's best. Whatever her reasons, she has created a space where her child sees her less as a source of comfort and more like that one relative who appears at dinner and mispronounces your name. So while she attends court functions, bathes in perfumes, or recovers from childbirth in a suite lined with tapestries, you are the one humming lullabies in the dark. You are the one the baby cries for, and it doesn't go unnoticed. The steward begins to frown when the baby quiets only in your arms. The mother stiffens when she tries to hold her child, and it squirms. He's fussy, she says. He must be ill. But deep down she knows. The child doesn't know her scent, doesn't know her voice, doesn't know her. It knows you. That bond, the one you never meant to forge, begins to grow teeth. Soon, whispers start. The baby is too attached. The nurse holds him too much. He won't even go to his own mother, as if you are the problem. As if you plotted this. But how could you not bond? You're sleep deprived. Hormonal. Grieving your own lost child or family. And here is this warm, blinking little person, utterly dependent on you. You feed it, burp it, bathe it, comfort it. You know the pitch of its cry, the curve of its gums, the twitch of its eyebrows before it throws up down your dress. It doesn't take long before you stop pretending that it's not yours. Emotionally, at least. Even if just for a moment. But the danger isn't just emotional, because attachment, that soft, sweet, unavoidable closeness, has social consequences. You see, Renaissance households were obsessed with hierarchy. Everyone had a place. Wet nurses were bodies with function, not hearts with feelings. The child was noble, you were not, and heaven forbid the line blur, because if a wet nurse became too beloved, too essential, she threatened the order of things. Servants whisper, mothers feel judged, fathers get uncomfortable. A child clinging to a nurse's skirts isn't cute, it's subversive. And subversion, in a world this rigid, gets punished. There are records, many actually, of wet nurses being dismissed for forming too strong a bond. The phrasing varies: overstepped her bounds, encouraged dependence, spoiled the child. In reality, they simply did their job too well. Lena knew this feeling. She'd begun to hum a little lullaby to the baby, the same one she once sang to Pietro. It wasn't fancy, just a simple melody about birds and bread and the smell of oranges. But the baby loved it, would stop crying instantly. One day, the Contessa walked in while she was singing. She froze. The song lingered in the air like steam. The Contessa didn't speak, just stared for a moment, then turned and left. The next morning, Lena's contract was shortened. The child must learn to bond with his mother, the steward said flatly. You've done your job too well. She was gone within the week. And the baby? He screamed for 3 nights straight. This wasn't just one case. It happened over and over, a cycle of attachment and removal. The baby bonds. The nurse loves. The mother panics. The bond is severed. Another nurse arrives. Repeat. It was a revolving door of care, and the ones who suffered most were the quietest. The babies, who didn't understand why warmth came and went. And the nurses, who had to learn to detach from something their bodies told them to protect. That's the cruelty of the system. It demanded intimacy but punished affection, expected devotion but rejected emotional residue. You could give your milk, just not your heart. And still, it happened. Because we're not machines, we're mammals. We bond. we attach. Even when we know it'll hurt. Still watch. Then you know what to do. Like, subscribe, whatever. But maybe, just maybe, hug your mom. Because someone once held you in the dark. And maybe she wasn't allowed to love you out loud. Breast milk. Ancient, organic, locally sourced, and deeply political. Because, in Renaissance Europe, milk wasn't just nourishment. It was power, status, symbolism. It was a bodily fluid that could make or break a bloodline, depending, of course, on whose breasts it came from. Let's start at the top. The nobility. These were people obsessed with bloodlines, virtue, and controlling everything from family trees to eyebrow shapes, and nothing threatened that control quite like the sticky, fleshy, and convenient realities of motherhood. So when a noblewoman gave birth, the question was not, will she breastfeed? It was more like, which peasant will we pay to do it for her? Because nursing, you see, was considered both physically degrading and politically risky. For one, it stretched out your body, and heaven forbid your figure be compromised in the pursuit of raising your actual child. But more importantly, it slowed down the baby machine. Remember, as long as a woman was nursing, she probably wasn't ovulating. And if she wasn't ovulating, she wasn't making heirs. And heirs, well, they were everything. A noble woman's womb was a national security asset, a generational insurance policy. There was no time for emotional bonding or chapped nipples. It was on to the next one. So the wet nurse was brought in, preferably poor, ideally attractive, but not too attractive, healthy but humble, not from the city, too many vices, but not too rustic either. You wanted wholesome milk, not a dairy rebellion, and this is where the politics really kick in. Because hiring a wet nurse wasn't just a practical decision, it was a statement. It said, I have the wealth to pay another woman to nourish my legacy. It said, my child will be stronger, purer, and better because their body was built on milk that's been vetted. There were even treatises warning against hiring wet nurses from tainted backgrounds. The milk of a lower-class woman was considered dangerous not because of any real science. This was centuries before pasteurization, remember, but because of the idea that morality was transferable. So a mother might go to great lengths to secure a clean nurse, one from a family with no known criminal history, no improper thoughts, no rebellious tendencies, ideally a woman with strong legs, mild opinions, and no dreams beyond producing high-quality fluids. You think I'm kidding? In Florence, elite families kept dossiers on potential nurses. They noted things like good demeanor, docile, and free from agitation, not unlike evaluating livestock or frankly interns. And the nurse herself had to submit physically, socially, and symbolically. She became part of the household, but never of it, close enough to hold the future of the family in her arms, but distant enough to be dismissed without ceremony. And yet, despite being treated as disposable, her presence was essential. Now imagine how complicated this got when the baby bonded more with the nurse than with its own mother. Oh wait, we just talked about that. But here's the kicker. Even that was political. Too much affection? You're overstepping. Too little? You're negligent. The child's body, their chubby, dribbling little form, became a battlefield for class distinction. Everything mattered. Who rocked them, who wiped their nose, who burped them after feeding, and above all, who made them strong. That's what noble families feared most. Weakness. Emotional, physical, political. A child who cried too much, who refused food, who clung to the wrong servant. All of it was read as a sign, not just of character, but of destiny. And when something went wrong, when a child failed to thrive, they didn't blame genetics or God or the flu going around. They blamed the milk, more specifically your milk. And so, hiring a wet nurse became like choosing a presidential running mate. Her background, her conduct, her reputation, all of it reflected on the family. If a child grew up impetuous, cowardly, too fat, or too thin, People talked. Well, you know, the nurse was from the south. Wink wink. Bit of a wild temperament. The milk was always to blame. Which meant you, the nurse, were a political liability wrapped in an apron. There are stories whispered in letters, hinted in legal records, of families covering up the origins of their wet nurses, or, in more scandalous cases, switching them if the child's temperament didn't align with expectations. That's right, early-stage personality rebranding through lactation swap. And it wasn't just within households. Cities competed too. In Venice, noble families were advised not to hire from Genoa. Too coarse. In Paris, rural nurses were imported from Normandy because their milk was mild and obedient, whatever that means. Imagine today's world applied the same logic. Hi, I'd like to enroll my baby in your daycare, but first, can you provide a full moral history of the staff? 3 generations back. I'd hate for my toddler to catch a bad attitude through proximity. Ridiculous? Sure, but this was the mindset. Milk was class-coded, politicized, mythologized, and no one asked the nurse how she felt about any of it. No one asked Lena. By now, she'd served 3 families. The latest one, a merchant-class couple pretending to be nobles, had very specific ideas about how she should behave in public. Don't speak, the wife had whispered. People might think you're the child's real mother, as if that were the true scandal. Not the substitution, but the recognition. Because to acknowledge the wet nurse was to admit that noble bloodlines rested, quite literally, in the hands of the poor. And that was too political to say out loud. So the system kept spinning. Milk flowed uphill, love flowed sideways, and the bodies of women like Lena carried futures they could never claim. Imagine you're 3 days old. You don't know what a name is. You don't know where home is. You know warmth. You know hunger. You know voices. Not words, just tones fading behind you. And now you are in a basket. Not metaphorically. Literally. Welcome to the Renaissance rural milk trade. A system so vast, so casually brutal, that newborns were packaged up and carted out of cities like bundles of cheese to be aged elsewhere. Because when the aristocracy ran out of wet nurses nearby, they looked outward to the countryside, to the hills, to the faceless poor, and sent their infants to them. This wasn't rare. This was how it worked. And so begins the journey of baby Lorenzo. Fictional, yes, but based on dozens, maybe hundreds of real infants who were sent off within hours of birth to be raised by strangers for the first year of their lives. Let's follow him. He's born in Florence, red-faced and squalling, the 3rd child of a wealthy merchant family looking to climb into the lower nobility. His mother has read the treatises. She's been warned about nursing. She must preserve her strength, her appearance, her fertility. The baby will be sent to the countryside. And so he's wrapped in linen, tied with lavender to mask the smell of travel, and handed to a courier, not a nurse, not a nanny, a messenger, like a parcel being dispatched. The journey is long, 2 days on horseback, sometimes 3, through mud, rain, clattering carts, and makeshift inns. No real protection, just a hired wet nurse waiting at the end of the line. Her name is Benedetta. She lives in a hamlet outside Arezzo. She has 6 children of her own, 2 living, 4 buried. Her husband broke his leg in the harvest and hasn't worked in months. She needs the coin, and so when the steward offered her a contract to feed and raise a nobleman's child, she said yes before even asking the baby's name. She doesn't speak the dialect well. She's never seen Florence. But she knows milk, and she knows grief, and she knows what it means to hold a life that isn't yours. Tightly, gently, and always at arm's length. When Lorenzo arrives, he is pale, cold, confused, but Benedetta wraps him in wool, places him to her breast, and whispers a prayer in the cadence of her dead daughter's name. And just like that, he begins to live. This was the system. 1 child out, 1 coin in. Over and over. By the 1500s, this rural outsourcing had become an entire sub-economy. Wet nurses in the countryside were cheaper, less supervised, and according to the logic of the elite, more natural. There was this bizarre pastoral ideal that rural milk was somehow purer, earthier, less corrupted by city life and strong spices. But make no mistake, this wasn't an idyllic retreat. This was outsourcing survival, at scale. Some nurses raised 3, 4, even 5 infants at once, paid per child, paid late, paid in installments, sometimes not paid at all. When the baby died, and they often did, the noble family might accuse the nurse of negligence, withhold payment, demand restitution. The pressure was enormous. You were handed a child, barely formed, told to make it thrive, and then blamed if it didn't, all while feeding your own. Because remember, most rural wet nurses still had babies of their own, so let's run the math. You've got 2 breasts, 1 child of yours, 1 noble baby. Which one do you feed first? The answer is obvious. The noble child pays. Your own. Hopefully survives. Hopefully. That's what happened to Benedetta. By the 3rd month, Lorenzo is growing, healthy, loud. Her employer is pleased. A letter arrives with a small bonus. They praise her, tell her to keep the child happy, clean, and strong. Meanwhile, Benedetta's daughter, her youngest, her last, has started to fade. She's 6 months old, thin, doesn't latch well anymore, sleeps too much. There's not enough milk for both. She tries everything. Herbs, bread soaked in goat's milk, prayer. But the baby dies anyway. No one sends a letter for that. No one writes a thank you. No one even knows. And so, Benedetta sings to Lorenzo using the name of the child she lost. He doesn't know the difference. Her body doesn't know the difference. But she does. And then, almost exactly 1 year later, the courier returns. Time's up. The child is fed, weaned, and must now return to Florence to be educated, coached, groomed to become a polite little member of a class that will never ask who kept him alive during his first fragile months. Benedetta places him in the basket again. This time she cries. And that, in essence, was the rural milk trade. A quiet, relentless cycle of sacrifice. One baby thriving at the expense of another. One woman pouring herself, literally, into a future that would never belong to her. The nobility thought it was efficient, logical, clean. It was none of those things. It was grief, packed in wool, and carried off in a cart. And it happened every day. Let that sink in. These weren't babysitters. They were lifelines, sometimes unraveling. So picture this. You've been hired as a wet nurse. Your contract is signed. Your breasts are expected to perform miracles. There's just one tiny problem. You're not producing milk. Not enough, anyway. Not for this particular baby who screams like it's being tortured every time it unlatches. Which, to be fair, is exactly how it feels when a breast gives up mid-suck. Now, if you were living in a world with lactation consultants and herbal tea marketed on Instagram, maybe this could be fixed. But you're in Renaissance Europe. The options here are, let's say, less than ideal. But you can't afford to quit, or admit failure, or, God forbid, get replaced. So you do what desperate people do when the stakes are survival. You fake it. Welcome to the shadowy underworld of milk fraud. Yes, it existed. Wet nurses who couldn't lactate, or not enough, had to improvise. Because no milk didn't mean no job. It meant no coin, and no coin meant no food, no rent, and in many cases, no home. So instead of confessing, you got creative. Let's start with the basics. Substitution. The first and most common workaround: animal milk. Goat's milk, if you were lucky. Sheep, if you were desperate. Sometimes donkey. And if you had absolutely nothing else, cow's milk, watered down and strained through cloth to reduce the curds. The baby hated it. The baby usually got sick. But it looked like you were feeding. and that bought you time. Next trick, pap. Not like your dad's old sweater. This pap was a bread and wine mash, soaked in warm water or milk, fed to babies with cloth-wrapped fingers or hollowed-out horns. It was basically mush, a soggy, fermented approximation of nutrition, also a fast track to food poisoning. And then there were the truly bizarre tools. There were primitive bottles made of clay or metal, with tiny holes and cork stoppers. Some wet nurses used wooden nipples, yes, wooden, dipped in broth. Others shaped wax cones, hollowed them out, and poured in lukewarm liquid. The baby latched to the wax while the nurse pretended it was flesh. That's right, Renaissance-era bottle-feeding cosplay. But deception came at a cost. Because babies aren't dumb. They know when something's off. They cry, they get sick, they lose weight. And when that happens, and it always happens, someone starts asking questions. Is the milk sour? Is the nurse impure? Did she eat onions? Was she thinking unclean thoughts during feeding? Rarely did anyone ask the obvious. Is she even lactating at all? Admitting that would be professional suicide. So the cover-up deepened. Some wet nurses tried to stimulate milk production using herbs. Fennel, anise, fenugreek, the usual suspects. Others went to midwives who offered less than sanctioned remedies. Massage, incantation. In one case documented in a rural Tuscan medical log, a woman was told to sleep with her breasts exposed under the full moon while chanting the name of the Virgin Mary backwards. Spoiler, it didn't work. Desperation mounted. And here's where the stories get darker. There were women, not many, but enough to stain the history books, who took in noble babies, couldn't feed them, and never reported it. They kept the child alive just long enough to fake health during inspections. They rubbed oil on the baby's skin to mimic weight gain, pinched its cheeks before a visit, hid the vomiting, hid the diarrhea, hid everything until they couldn't. Some got away with it, others didn't. One story stands out. Lucrezia Di Nardo, a wet nurse outside Bologna, hired to care for the daughter of a minor noble. When her milk dried up in the second month, she fed the baby bread pap, mixed with goat broth. The child developed rickets, then fever, then died. The family accused Lucrezia of poisoning. She denied it, claimed the baby had been sick from the start. The case went to court. Witnesses testified. Doctors weighed in. In the end, she was acquitted, but her name was blacklisted. No one hired her again. She starved to death the following winter. Let that sink in. One failed feeding, whether by fraud, accident, or desperation, and your entire life evaporated. But the pressure to fake it wasn't always about survival. Sometimes it was about fear. Fear of being judged. Fear of being called barren. Fear of being unfit, a word that carried moral weight back then, like a curse. Because wet nursing wasn't just physical labor, it was moral performance. To not lactate was to be considered incomplete, so women faked it. Badly, bravely, in secret. And when they were caught, it was never the system that got blamed. It was them, their character, their bodies. As if they had chosen to fail. Lena had once gone dry for 3 days. She'd been sick, fevered, sweating through her shift dress. The milk stopped. The baby cried endlessly. She crushed fennel in water, prayed, tried to hide it, but it was obvious. The steward came, took the baby, said they would evaluate the situation. Lena wept that night. Not just for the loss of the child, but for the knowledge that she'd failed in the only way a wet nurse could fail. The next day, the milk returned. Just like that, as if it knew she had nothing else. Sometimes the body bends to will. Sometimes it breaks, and sometimes it lies. All right, we've covered what happens when milk won't come, when it runs out, when it's faked, and when it gets politicized to the point of absurdity. But here's a question no one ever thinks to ask. What happened when the milk just wouldn't leave? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Breasts don't have an off switch. Wet nurses didn't just produce milk on command like divine vending machines. Sometimes they overproduced. Sometimes they became engorged. Sometimes they experienced blocked ducts, or what Renaissance midwives charmingly called stony breasts. And when that happened, they needed relief. Now, you might assume they just hand-expressed. Sure, that was common. But what if you were in pain, exhausted, and didn't have time to sit in a quiet room with warm cloths and patience? You needed help. Enter the proto-pump. Now, to be clear, no one was using words like pump or suction device, but the concept existed. And what emerged from that need, cobbled together from desperation, folklore, and a kind of feral inventiveness, was the earliest known toolkit for milk extraction. Let's start with the hollow horn. This wasn't a euphemism. It was literally an animal horn. Goat, usually hollowed, sanded, and shaped into a cone. One end went over the nipple. The other was sucked by the nurse herself, or by a helper. Yes, another person, creating suction to draw the milk out. It worked in the same way that drinking through a broken straw kind of works. There were leaks. There were choking hazards. There were moments when someone accidentally inhaled instead of exhaled, and history doesn't record what happened next because presumably everyone agreed to never speak of it again. Then came the cloth twist method. This involved wrapping a length of linen around the breast and twisting slowly and methodically to apply pressure and force milk toward the nipple. It was crude, it was painful, and if done too forcefully, it could rupture ducts or cause inflammation. But when your choices are that or waking up feeling like your chest is being filled with molten bricks, you do what you have to do. There were also wooden rollers, cylindrical tools used to gently knead the breast and push milk forward. These were more common among midwives than wet nurses, and were usually passed around like secret knowledge. No one documented them properly, probably because explaining to a priest why you owned a carved wooden roller that smelled faintly of vinegar wasn't ideal. And then there were the mouths. Yes, sometimes the best, or only way to relieve blocked milk was to have another baby nurse, even if it wasn't hungry, or to ask another woman, or in stranger cases, to enlist a partner. There are documents, whispered anecdotes, and even letters from concerned doctors warning against improper milk sharing and lustful relief. Because let's be honest, in a society that feared female flesh, any bodily act involving a breast and another adult was automatically filed under moral panic. But it wasn't about lust, it was about survival, because when milk builds up and has nowhere to go, it hurts. A lot. Fever, swelling, infection, the beginnings of mastitis. In extreme cases, abscesses had to be cut and drained manually, without anesthesia. Let that sink in. You're a woman, poor, tired, holding someone else's baby. Your breasts are so full it feels like your ribs are splitting, and the only tools available are animal parts, cloths, or another human's mouth. The Renaissance, where innovation and desperation danced cheek to cheek. But it wasn't all chaos. Some midwives, especially in Italy, began to keep notes. They documented techniques, compared herbal poultices, recommended warm compresses made from sage, chamomile, or even crushed bread soaked in wine. One Florence-based manual even described a device of silver and glass, used to draw milk gently, though it's unclear whether this was real or just wishful thinking written by a very tired, noblewoman. Did it work? Sometimes. Was it sanitary? Absolutely not. Did it help enough to keep the system going? Yes. Barely. And yet, this entire system, this rough, improvised infrastructure of extraction, was invisible to the noble families who benefited from it. They didn't ask how milk got from body to mouth. They just demanded it appear. Warm, clean, on schedule. Lena had her own method. She used a gourd, hollowed, soaked in vinegar, softened with steam. She fitted the narrow end over her breast and gently rocked it. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, but it helped. She learned the technique from another nurse, who'd learned it from her grandmother, who'd once worked in a convent. The gourd lived in a cloth bag under Lena's cot. No one asked about it. No one wanted to know. And that was the story for most wet nurses. They didn't just feed. They engineered. They managed pain, pressure, infection, and shame. They innovated under duress, passed knowledge in whispers, and built a silent science around a job nobody wanted to understand. It wasn't glamorous. It was necessity, pressed against flesh, aching at midnight, shared across generations, one painful drop at a time. Not every wet nurse followed the rules. In fact, some of them broke them in ways that would make a medieval bishop choke on his communion wafer. Because when you create a system that commodifies human milk, regulates female bodies, and piles on guilt, surveillance, and starvation wages, well, let's just say not every woman plays by the book. Some wet nurses went rogue. Now, before we dive into the scandals, let's be clear. The vast majority of wet nurses did their jobs with heartbreaking devotion. They endured loss, mistreatment, and moral judgment while keeping babies alive with nothing but their own bodies. They were the unsung heroes of an era obsessed with hierarchy and inheritance. But as with any industry, especially one built on desperation and human labor, there were cracks, and in those cracks, chaos. Let's start with the basics. Abandonment. There are documented cases of wet nurses simply vanishing. Contract signed, baby delivered. Everything seems fine. And then one morning, the crib is empty. The nurse is gone. Sometimes she takes the baby with her. Sometimes she leaves it on a church doorstep. Sometimes it's just her shift dress and a half-empty jug of goat's milk left behind. Why run? Because sometimes the pressure became too much. Or maybe the payment was delayed. Or maybe, and this is uncomfortable to admit, she never wanted the job in the first place. Then there's baby swapping. Yes, it happened. Wet nurses who were caring for both a noble baby and their own child might, out of grief, instinct, or cunning, switch them. Sometimes by accident. Sometimes very much on purpose. One case from Naples involved a wet nurse who lost her baby to illness, but continued raising the noble child as her own, claiming it was hers all along. When the noble family came to retrieve the heir, she refused to give him back. The case dragged on for months. In the end, the child was returned, but the nurse vanished into the countryside. The local priest called it a confusion of souls. Others called it theft. But the real question was, did she love that baby? Did she see it as hers? And if so, was it really a crime? Then there's the infamous tale of Caterina di Siena, not the saint, but the scandal. Caterina was hired to nurse the infant son of a Florentine merchant. All went smoothly, until the baby developed seizures, fever, stiff limbs. He died within days. The family was devastated, suspicious. They accused Caterina of poisoning him. The accusation? That she had fed him sour milk, milk corrupted by lust, bad diet, or demonic influence. A local apothecary testified that he'd seen her eating mushrooms. Another claimed she'd been spotted speaking to a foreign man, always a bad sign in records written by terrified people. She was arrested, tortured, confessed to nothing. Eventually released, but not cleared. Her reputation was destroyed. What probably happened? The baby had epilepsy, or a fever, or nothing at all that a nurse could prevent. But that didn't matter, because when things went wrong, fear followed. And fear in a pre-scientific world bred conspiracy, which brings us to milk witches. Yes, that was a thing. In some parts of Europe, especially rural Germany and northern Italy, wet nurses were rumored to possess unnatural powers, the ability to charm milk, to make a baby docile, or dead, to steal milk from other women with spells. There were whispers of nurses who used herbs to enchant noble families who became too loved, too powerful. In other words, women who didn't stay in their place. One superstition claimed a rogue wet nurse could dry up a rival's milk simply by crossing her doorway backward and spitting. Another claimed that a nurse could cause madness in a baby by singing the same lullaby in reverse. Ridiculous? Of course. But believable to people who didn't understand illness, and who desperately needed to blame someone. And who better than the woman cradling your heir at night? But not all going rogue meant malice. Sometimes it meant resistance. Some wet nurses refused to follow dietary rules, ate forbidden foods in secret, wrote their own lullabies, whispered folk tales into the ears of noble babies, stories about wolves and witches and mothers who sacrificed everything. They passed down culture, wisdom, even subtle rebellion. One nurse reportedly taught a child to say his prayers in the local dialect instead of Latin, a small act but one that scandalized the household chaplain. These women understood the power they held, not political, not legal, but emotional. They were the first voice, the first face, the first comfort. That power scared people. And when a nurse stepped outside the lines, showed too much personality, demanded better pay, refused to answer to a steward who pinched her arm, she was dismissed, branded dangerous, even when all she did was ask for what she needed. Lena once asked for an extra blanket. The winter had been brutal. The baby was thriving, but she was freezing at night. The steward scoffed. "Do you think you're the lady of the house?" She didn't reply, just wrapped the baby tighter, sang softer, dreamed of a world where asking to be warm wasn't a declaration of war. So yes, some wet nurses went rogue. Some fled, some fought, some fell apart. But most just did what they could, in a world that gave them everything to lose and nothing to own. Every job ends, even the ones carved into your body. There comes a moment, sometimes sudden, sometimes creeping, when your milk slows, then stops. The baby you've nursed begins to wean, the contract expires, and the door, which once opened for you with polite obligation, quietly closes. You are no longer useful. There is no fanfare, no retirement party, no bonus for years of cuddling, crying, rocking, and feeding through fever and frostbite. Just a nod. Maybe a small payment if your employer isn't behind on their books. Then you're gone. Welcome to the afterlife of a wet nurse. Let's talk about what happens when the breasts go dry. Because if you think the end of a nursing career came with a gentle transition to something softer, teaching, midwifery, even respected old age, you're going to be disappointed. For most women, it meant poverty. Your skill set was specific, specialized. You had no land, often no husband, possibly no children, depending on what you'd lost or had to give away along the way. You couldn't just reinvent yourself at 40, especially not in a society that treated aging women like expired produce. Some found work as general nursemaids, caring for older children, cleaning, sewing, but those jobs paid less, expected more, and lacked the strange, intimate power that had once defined your world. You were no longer the wet angel. You were just the tired woman with veiny hands and stories no one asked to hear. Others returned home, if they had one. But time is cruel. The woman who leaves her village for years, who returns without a child of her own, who has lived in noble houses and seen marble and gold, is no longer of her place. She becomes a curiosity, a cautionary tale. Whispers follow. She fed other people's babies. Her milk's run dry, but her mouth hasn't. She used to be someone, which brings us to Lena. She is 43 now. Her last child, the one she fed, loved and lost to time and money, is grown. Not hers anymore. Not really. She served 4 families, been praised, scorned, forgotten. Her body has changed. Her breasts, once admired for their vitality, are now sore, stretched, silent. She lives in a rented room above a cobbler shop. The ceiling leaks. The walls are thin. She keeps a small jar of olive oil for her joints, and a single wooden rattle, a memento from a child she'll never see again. Work has dried up. Like the rest of her, there are girls younger, plumper, with fresher babies, and fuller cheeks. There always are. One day she sees a posting. A merchant family seeking a wet nurse. She doesn't apply. She knows better. Instead, she begins mending linens. Washing. Quiet tasks for a quiet woman. The steward from her last position passes her in the market. Doesn't recognize her, or pretends not. That's the real erasure. Not the absence of money, the absence of memory. Because for all her labor, for all the nights spent walking circles on stone floors, whispering lullabies into the velvet hush, Lena has become invisible. The babies she raised? They're learning Latin now, inherited lands, wearing lace. They won't remember the woman who rocked them through fevers or caught their first smiles. Their mothers don't bring her back for birthdays. No one writes. No one thinks to say thank you. Why would they? Milk is a function, not a story. But here's the quiet truth. The body remembers. Lena's hands, curled in sleep, still shaped to cradle. Her ears catch phantom cries. Her shoulders ache where babies once leaned. Sometimes she dreams of Pietro, her own son, lost so long ago, and wakes up searching for him in the folds of her blanket. She's not alone in this. All across Europe, there are women like her. Former wet nurses turned ghosts in their own lives, living off scraps, telling stories no one listens to, remembering things no one else recalls. A woman in Seville sells fish, wrapped in old cloth, and hums lullabies while she scales them. A woman outside Rouen sharpens knives, her knuckles swollen, her eyes tracking every child that passes her stall. A woman in a Tuscan village folds linen so precisely it looks like sculpture. She never speaks unless asked. They are everywhere and nowhere. They gave their bodies to the future and got no past in return. And yet, they persist. They braid their hair. They light candles. They bless the children of strangers. They carry on because they have always carried everything. That is the legacy of a wet nurse. To be essential, then erased. To hold life, then vanish from it. It is brutal and beautiful. It is ordinary heroism with no witness. So if you pass an old woman today, bent, quiet, unseen, remember she may have once been someone's everything. The hands that once held the next generation are now empty, but they still remember how. Let's talk about the babies. Not the cooing bundles of Renaissance cuteness with embroidered swaddles and God-appointed destinies. No, we're talking about what happens after that, after the wet nurse, after the nursery, after the noble mother barely remembers which servant breastfed which child. What happens to the child who never knew their mother? Welcome to Renaissance Mummy Issues. You're gonna need a chaise lounge and a very old, judgmental therapist. Because behind the perfumed courts, beneath the oil paintings of Madonna and Child, there were generations of kids raised by strangers, nursed by hired hands, touched, soothed, sung to, by someone who disappeared before they could even form a full memory. Then one day, you're back with your real family. Except nothing feels real. Let's take Giovanni, son of a Florentine banker. We have letters, real ones, from him as a young man studying abroad. He writes to his tutor, not his parents, says he feels adrift, that his mother speaks to him as if she's reading lines from a play, that his father only touches his head like he's testing a melon. He remembers someone named Lucia, a smell like rosemary, a voice that sang to him at night. She wasn't his mother. She was the woman who fed him, bathed him, comforted him, and then vanished. Probably dismissed once he was weaned. Her name wouldn't be in the family archive, but Giovanni carried her, somewhere, in his muscle memory, in the lullabies he hummed without knowing why. Modern psychology calls this attachment disruption. The Renaissance just called it custom. And while we can't diagnose historical trauma through a time-traveling therapist, We can look at the writings, the behavior, the fragments, and see a pattern. Children raised by wet nurses often grew up disconnected from their mothers, from intimacy, from emotional fluency. Because what does it teach you when the first person who ever loved you is a servant and then gone? It teaches you that love is temporary, transactional, that bodies are useful until they aren't. And then you grow up, you marry, you have children, but no one taught you how to hold them. No one showed you how to stay when things get hard. And the cycle repeats. One nobleman, unnamed in the records but referred to in court as the Marble Baron, reportedly refused to touch his own children, said it was the wet nurse's domain, even after they were weaned, even when they cried. His wife once confessed to a priest that she didn't know how to comfort them, because no one had comforted her. Generations of emotional stunting, all wrapped in velvet. Of course, not every child turned out cold. Some turned out resilient, even warm, but the system didn't help them. And that's the point. Now imagine you're a modern parent watching this unfold. You read this and think, I hug my kid, I pack their lunch, we have a chore chart, and stickers, and co-regulation apps. Great. But look deeper. Are we so different? Because the Renaissance had wet nurses, and we have screens, nannies, double shifts, and emotional outsourcing of another kind. We don't pay women to nurse our kids. We underpay them to raise them while we work impossible hours to survive. Different breast, same bruise. One child in 1490 cries for a woman whose name he's forgotten. One child in 2025 cries while FaceTiming their mom from the daycare lunchroom. Both want something simple, present, and both will carry the absence in ways they can't name. Let that sink in, because love isn't just a feeling, it's a practice. And when that practice is interrupted, outsourced, postponed, or silenced, something is lost. Now back to the Renaissance. Some adult children did search for their wet nurses. Records exist of noblemen sending letters to locate the woman who raised me. One even offered to pay her dowry. Years later, another brought his wet nurse into his household as a nursemaid for his own children. Was it guilt? Gratitude? A desperate need to reclaim what was missing? Maybe all of the above. Because memory is strange. It twists and frays and reweaves itself in adulthood. You may not remember the face, but you remember the feeling. The warmth of arms, the sound of a lullaby that didn't come from your mother, the ache of realizing love was borrowed, not yours to keep. In one rare case, a grown noblewoman wrote a prayer, yes, a prayer, to her wet nurse. It was tucked into the back of her personal devotional book. It read, "To the one who fed me when my own mother would not, may your hands be known to God, even if they were forgotten by men." And now, centuries later, we're remembering them. The children too. The ones who grew up with gold spoons but hollow hearts, who had everything but comfort, who inherited castles, but not closeness, who maybe, just maybe, whispered the wrong name when they had nightmares. So no, Renaissance wet nursing wasn't just about milk, it was about connection. And what happens when you buy it, borrow it, break it, or bury it? Generations paid the price, and we're still counting. History is a collection of stories, some loud, some quiet, some shouted from rooftops, others whispered in shadows. The story of wet nurses falls squarely into the latter category. For centuries, the women who fed, comforted, and sometimes loved the children of the elite have been erased, forgotten by textbooks, omitted from portraits, overlooked in genealogies. Their names vanished like milk spilled on stone floors, but their labor, their sacrifice, that lingers. This chapter is about memory, about the spaces history refuses to fill, about the stories we don't tell. Let's return to Lena one last time. She was never painted, never celebrated in song. No statues of her grace cathedral steps. She did not sign treaties or give speeches. She did not write laws. She fed. That was her legacy. And legacy is funny, because it's not always what we leave behind. Sometimes it's what we make invisible. Wet nurses built the future, held the airs, sustained the lines of power, and yet they were erased. Why? Because their work was intimate, invisible, bodily. And society has a complicated relationship with intimacy, especially when it involves women's bodies. Public stories prefer heroics, wars, thrones, power plays. They do not prefer wet, leaking, sleepless nights. But imagine the alternative. Imagine a world where every royal child starved to death, where every noble line ended in infant graves, where the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and everything that followed was cut short by hunger. That was the reality without wet nurses. And yet, society only remembers the kings and queens who survived. The queens who nursed their own children, rare. The wet nurses who kept those children alive, countless. Lena's story is not unique. She is one of millions. Women who worked in silence, who loved in absence, who sacrificed in invisibility, and they left behind something more than history can record. They left behind life. There are small traces, a ledger entry, a contract note, a letter from a noble woman thanking her nurse for your endless patience and kindness. These fragments are precious. They remind us that history is not only made by those in power, but by those who serve it, often at great personal cost. They remind us that memory is layered, that love is complicated, that survival depends on unseen hands. So as you close your eyes tonight, breathe that in. The world you see, with its great leaders and famous names, is built on the backs of the forgotten, on the milk that flowed in hidden rooms, on the quiet sacrifices of women like Lena. Let that sink in, because their story fed the world, even if the world forgot their names. And maybe, in remembering them, we begin to understand a little more about what it means to be human. If you thought the Renaissance had a monopoly on wet nursing, you're in for a surprise. Because the global breast trade, yes, that's a phrase you'll never unhear, stretches far beyond the cobblestone streets and candlelit palazzos of Europe. Let's start with the world's oldest profession. No, not that one. The other, milk on demand. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's children were entrusted to sultane, women chosen for their beauty, health, and loyalty. These wet nurses didn't just nourish future princes and princesses, they became influential fixtures at court. Some rose to positions of quiet power, a trusted whisper in a harem world of secrets. In imperial China, the practice was elevated to ritual. Wet nurses, often selected from the countryside for their perceived untainted milk, were brought into the forbidden city to nurse the emperor's children. They had their own quarters, their own servants. Some wielded more day-to-day influence over the young than their own mothers, who were kept at arm's length by layers of hierarchy and protocol. Then there's the darkest chapter, the Americas. In colonial and antebellum America, enslaved African women were forced, not hired, to nurse the children of their enslavers. This was not a side gig, it was theft, both of labor and of love. These women, torn from their own children, were compelled to pour their bodies' nourishment into the sons and daughters of those who claimed to own them. The cruelty doubled back, as these mothers' milk fed white infants. Their own children went hungry or died. Some historians call this milk slavery, a phrase as chilling as it is accurate. And it didn't stop there. In North Africa and the Middle East, wet nursing became a system of kinship. Milk siblings, children nursed by the same woman, formed bonds considered nearly as strong as blood. These relationships shaped marriages, alliances, and even politics. To be someone's milk brother meant a loyalty that could override law. India, too, had its own system. Among the royal Rajputs, it was common for princes to be sent to the homes of trusted wet nurses, far from court intrigue, to be raised in simpler, purer environments. The wet nurse became a second mother, sometimes more influential than the first. So what unites all these stories? Power, gender, survival, and the relentless logic of a world that treats women's bodies as tools for someone else's future. Across continents, the pattern repeats. Poor women, rural women, enslaved women, immigrant women, all hired or forced to feed the children of the wealthy and powerful. The economic transaction is the same. The moral gymnastics, identical. The grief, universal. And what about the emotional cost? Across cultures, letters, oral histories, and even folk tales speak to the anguish and pride of wet nurses, women who gave life but rarely received credit. Some found honor, others only heartbreak. One account from 19th century Louisiana describes an enslaved wet nurse, Sarah, whose own baby died while she was forced to nurse the master's child. The mistress wept, claimed Sarah's sorrow as her own, and then insisted Sarah return to her duties the next morning. The grief was acknowledged, but never truly allowed. Or take May, a nurse in Qing Dynasty China, who left behind a journal. She writes of sleepless nights, the terror of making a mistake, the secret love for a child she was never meant to keep. She was paid well by village standards, but what she lost can't be measured in silver coins. And there are the ones whose names never appear. The anonymous, the disappeared. Their stories are dust, swept aside by kings and laws, and the endless churn of history. Let that settle on your mind. The global breast trade isn't just a footnote. It's the spine of civilization, woven into every era, every empire. It's the story of power, who has it, who gives it, and who is drained by it. And it always comes down to the same aching question. What does it mean when even your ability to love is extracted for profit? That question haunts. Across centuries, continents, and countless silent rooms, it echoes. The world was built not just by warriors and kings, but by women whose bodies and heartbreak fueled empires. And even now, most of their names are gone. History doesn't vanish. It lingers, quiet as a heartbeat, inside the things we inherit. And nowhere is this more intimate, or more overlooked, than in the way we feed, nurture, and care. Wet nursing in the West, at least, is mostly a relic now. Science, sanitation, bottles, formula. They've rewritten the story, but old ghosts remain, hiding in plain sight. Take breast milk banks, for example. Hospitals collect, pasteurize, and ration the milk of donor mothers to fragile newborns. The language is medical, the contracts digital, the nurses unseen. But at its heart, the same transaction. One woman's body nourishing another's child. Silent, practical, uncelebrated. Or consider surrogacy. Women hired to carry and birth babies for those who cannot. There's money, there are contracts, there's even a global market, with agencies and legal teams and waiting lists. Behind every headline about miracle births, there's a story of labor, physical, emotional, sometimes invisible, performed by women who are rarely invited into the family portrait. And then there are the quiet care workers, the daycare staff, the nannies, the foster mothers. Still mostly women. Still mostly undervalued. Still filling the spaces where love has been outsourced. Not out of malice, but out of necessity, exhaustion, economics. Society moves fast. Old rituals disappear. But the fundamental question hasn't changed. Who nourishes the world when no one's watching? Lena's story, Lena's hands. They echo now, in 100 hidden places. In the mother pumping at midnight for a baby in NICU. In the grandmother who makes formula when her daughter's milk won't come. In the nurse who soothes a stranger's child, quietly, without thanks. Even in stranger places, content creators who monetize the fantasy of maternal care, from OnlyFans to YouTube, trading intimacy for coin. The body, ever adaptable, still being bought and sold. Milk, metaphorical or literal, remains currency. But something has changed. Slowly, voices are being heard. Stories are being told. We talk now, if not enough, about labor, about compensation, about the cost of care, about the dignity owed to those who make survival possible. We're beginning to remember the laners of the world, not as relics, not as background noise, but as the foundation on which everything else stands. It's not just nostalgia, it's responsibility, because if history teaches anything, it's that the invisible always matters most. The unseen labor, the forgotten names, the hands that work in the dark while the rest of us sleep. Lena's journey, from mother to milkmaid to memory, isn't unique. It's a chain, stretching backward and forward. Each link, another woman, another act of care, another story nearly lost. And in that chain, there's quiet power. The world, for all its noise, is built by the ones who feed, comfort, and heal, by those who give and give until there's nothing left, and then find a way to give more, by those who do what's needed, even when no one says thank you. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine all those hands, ancient, tired, loving, holding up the world, cradling it, feeding it, letting go, again and again. That's the echo that lingers, the song that won't die, who nourishes the world when no one's watching, and who tells their story. Let it be us. Let it begin, at last, with their names. If this story left a mark or a lump in your throat, go ahead and subscribe, because we're not done telling the stories of history's forgotten lifelines, the ones who didn't wear crowns, but fed the ones who did. Like, comment, remember Lena, and maybe call your